What if I told you that in the second week of testing in Bahrain we didn't simply see Lewis Hamilton adapting to the Ferrari SF-26, but we saw the exact moment in which he began to mold it in his image and likeness? Because while many were looking at the times on the screen, what was truly important was happening in silence. 117 laps of structural work, millimeter adjustments to the aerodynamic window, deliberate mechanical balance tests and energy management that was beginning to fit the style of the 7-time world champion. It was not a superficial adaptation. It wasn't marketing. It was method. Hamilton went from fighting against the rear axle in the first week to showing consistency in slow sectors, better traction in 90-degree corners and much more homogeneous tire management in long runs. And that completely changes the narrative. But here is the big question that defines this entire analysis. Are we simply seeing a natural preseason improvement, or the birth of a Ferrari that is beginning to have Hamilton DNA? Because if what happened in that second week was the turning point, then SF-26 isn't just being learned, it's being transformed. The second week of testing in Bahrain began with a signal that went unnoticed by many, but that changes everything when analyzed in depth. Ferrari opened the day with 117 accumulated laps between Charles Leclerc in the morning and Lewis Hamilton in the afternoon, exceeding 600 kilometers of useful running time. And this is not a trivial fact. In the preseason, kilometers are not given away. Every lap has a purpose. Every stint answers a specific technical question. Every setup change is a hypothesis tested. 3 very specific transformations began to be seen on the track. First, an evident consistency in the slow sectors. In Bahrain, low-speed sections are extremely sensitive to mechanical balance and progressive torque delivery. An unstable car punishes oversteer on entry and traction on exit. However, Hamilton began to show a cleaner line, fewer corrections and a much earlier and more progressive application of the throttle. Second, 90-degree cornering traction was noticeably improved. This is key because those corners represent the most critical point of the circuit in terms of lateral loading and hybrid power transition. If the motor map is not perfectly calibrated, the car skids or becomes erratic. In the second week, that phase began to look more controlled. Not spectacular, not flashy, but more stable. And third, tire management in long runs was much more homogeneous than in the first test run. This is where you really start to see the pilot's hand. Hamilton is historically one of the best demotion managers. But to apply that strength, you need a predictable rear axle. What was observed is that the SF-26 began to respond within a more stable thermal window, allowing it to extend the performance of the compound without abrupt drop peaks. Now, the most interesting thing is not only the result, but the method. Internal analyses reflect that Hamilton was not changing setups randomly. It wasn't trial and error without direction. It moved specific parameters: height, rake, aeromechanical balance. This implies a progressive understanding of the aerodynamic flow and how the car breathes in braking and lateral support phases. In other words, he was beginning to dialogue with the car. The Ferrari showed clear improvements in consistency, traction and thermal management, yes. But he also hinted that its operational window is extremely delicate. The 2026 concept under which this car is born is not forgiving. It's a car that depends on everything being within a very specific range of parameters. Correct height, exact rake, well-distributed downforce, and above all, perfectly synchronized energy management. When that timing is maintained, Hamilton can exploit the car as a tool. When it is lost, behavior changes radically. And here is the critical point. It is not yet completely fused with the SF-26. During the long runs of the second week, it was seen that, although the degradation was more homogeneous than in the first test, the car depended enormously on keeping the battery within the optimal window. The moment the system began to clip energy or leave the ideal range, the balance in the middle phase of the curve became more nervous. Not dramatic, but enough to force corrections. This is not a minor detail. In a regulation where the elimination of the MGUH modifies the power delivery and forces an even more strategic management of the electrical deployment, any irregularity in this phase directly affects the pilot's confidence in the rear support. And Hamilton is a driver who needs to feel stability in the braking support acceleration transition to extract maximum performance. Now, what is fascinating is how he responded to that limit. Instead of looking for quick turns to disguise the situation, his approach was surgical. I moved specific parameters, adjusted height and aeromechanical balance with clear intention. I wasn't chasing an isolated tenth. I was trying to widen the car's operating window. And this changes the dimension of the analysis. Because if the SF-26 depends so much on operating in a narrow band, then the real challenge isn't pure speed. It's the stability of that speed over an entire run. It is consistency under changing conditions. It is the ability to maintain balance when the track evolves, when the wind changes, when the fuel drops. Bahrain's second week showed progress, yes, but he also made it clear that the Ferrari concept is still sensitive. However, this is where the narrative tilts in Hamilton's favor again. We no longer saw a driver reacting to the limitations of the car. We saw a pilot trying to redraw those limits. He went from adapting to the operational range to actively working to expand it. And that difference is monumental in the preseason. Because if they can widen that window even a small percentage, the SF-26 could transform from a delicate car to an extremely efficient car. And here appears the great tension of Act 2. The adaptation has advanced, but the concept is still not completely tame. The chemistry is growing, but absolute stability is not yet guaranteed. The question is no longer whether Hamilton can understand the car. That became clear in this second week. The real question is whether Ferrari can turn that understanding into a solid enough foundation that, when the first Grand Prix rolls around, the SF-26 doesn't depend on perfect execution, but rather tolerates the chaos of a real race. Because in the tests everything is controlled. Because after the second week in Bahrain we are no longer simply talking about positive feelings. We are talking about a real technical base on which a season can be built. Hamilton made it clear that he is no longer learning the car from scratch, but rather working on a foundation that begins to feel like his own, as if the SF-26 already had part of his DNA. And that phrase at this point in the story takes on enormous weight, because it doesn't mean that the car is perfect. It means that the adaptation process has crossed the critical threshold, the moment in which the driver and car stop being separate entities and begin to function as a system. During this second week, Ferrari did not seek headlines with isolated fast laps. It focused on long runs, aerodynamic correlation, and exploration of different thermal and loading windows. That reveals something key: inner confidence. A team that doubts looks for a reference time. A team that believes in its concept seeks structural understanding. And Hamilton responded exactly as Ferrari needed. His methodical approach, adjusting height, rake, and aeromechanical balance with clear intent, not only accelerated his adaptation, but generated critical information to expand that very delicate operational window that the SF-26 displayed in Act 2. He wasn't just driving. I was decoding the car. But here's the highlight. In the start tests, with the new hybrid architecture without MGUH, Ferrari showed a clean and powerful launch while other teams suffered with lag or anti-stall. That detail may seem minor in a test. It is not. In a regulation where torque management at low revs will be decisive in real starts, finding an efficient calibration before starting the season is a strategic advantage. This brings us to the most powerful conclusion of the entire process. Bahrain's second week was not a demonstration of absolute superiority. It was a demonstration of correct direction. The SF-26 still depends on keeping power within its ideal window to deliver its best performance. It's still not a forgiving car. But now he has something he didn't have in the first week. A driver who is no longer trying to figure it out, but rather perfect it. The second week of testing in Bahrain did not leave us with a legendary lap or a scandalous headline. He left us something much more important: evidence. Evidence that Lewis Hamilton's adaptation to the Ferrari SF-26 is not being improvised. It is not being forced. It is being built with method, with miles, with structural analysis, and with a clear intention to mold the car around its style. The 117 laps accumulated in a single day, focused on long runs and aerodynamic correlation, were not an endurance exercise. They were a technical statement. Ferrari wasn't looking to impress. I was understanding. And Hamilton wasn't surviving a team change. I was starting to influence the direction of the project. We saw how the rear axle went from suffering in side wind conditions in the first week, to showing consistency in slow sectors, better traction in 90-degree curves, and much more homogeneous tire management in long runs. That's no coincidence. That's real adaptation. We also saw the limits. SF-26 still depends on a narrow energy window to deliver its best performance. When everything is synchronized, the car responds precisely. When management falls outside the ideal range, behavior loses fluidity. That fragility still exists. But here's the key difference. Now there is direction. Hamilton is no longer trying to understand the car from the outside. It is working from within. Moving height, rake, and aeromechanical balance with intention. Adjusting the system to widen that critical window. Decoding how the flow breathes, how it delivers power, how the rear axle responds under load. And that completely changes the narrative. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.